My dear sisters and brothers, one of the hardest things to do for a Christian is to look at Jesus on the cross crucified. It is very difficult for us, at least for me, to look at a cross, to look at a crucifix. I know it's a very household object. Today we have crosses all over our house, we have them on our person, we see them so often in the church. It is a very natural sight to behold. But if you sit for a moment and just let everything pass by and focus on the cross, it should be very difficult to watch. I remember the full weight of this I understood or felt when I watched the movie The Passion of Christ, directed by Mel Gibson. And the fact was that I couldn't even watch the movie from cover to cover completely. Because at specific sections, I had to close my eyes, I had to close my ears, because what I was seeing, I just could not let it assimilate within me. I just couldn't accept it. I couldn't comprehend that a human being or God made man, God Himself, could go through so much of suffering. And so whenever I see a cross, or when I spend some time and I just try to focus on the cross, it's the most difficult thing to do. And somewhere I suppose it's reasonable, because deep down I suppose we all know and understand, those who are the faithful, that when we see and behold Jesus on the cross, ultimately we know He died for my sin. That if Jesus was present here today, if He incarnated in our time and our century, we would also be the ones who would cry, crucify Him, crucify Him. And we would be the ones who would give assent to His death, to His crucifixion. I think deep down we all perhaps understand it, which is why to look at Jesus on the cross is the hardest thing. And so what do we do? Because ultimately we are Christians, we are Catholics. We look at Jesus through filters. When we put a filter, it eases our eyes from seeing difficult things. I just want to mention 3 filters to you that are very common that we use. The first one is, when we look at Jesus on the cross, or a crucifix, or a picture, or even Mel Gibson's movie, we don't see Jesus completely naked. There's always a piece of clothing that is covering a particular section of His body. If you study a Roman crucifixion by history, Roman crucifixions were never done with any piece of clothing on the accused's body. They were completely stripped naked and then they were crucified. And which is why, apart from everything else, apart from all the pain and the violence, the basic fact that we can't see a human stark naked was why the crucifixions were so difficult to behold. Imagine if you have to see Jesus absolutely 100% naked, just the way He came into this world, when He was born into this world. If you had to see Him, it is not a pretty sight to behold. I wonder who would have the courage to even look a loving person who loved Jesus. Would he have even the courage to look at it? It is such a difficult sight to behold and to comprehend and to accept. And which is why, as I said, that we look at Jesus through various filters. The second filter with which we look at Jesus and Jesus' crucifixion or the cross is that He was God. So somewhere in the back of our heads, we keep this tape running that, ultimately He was God. Like, He could go through it. Like, maybe I won't be able to go through it, especially if I'm innocently accused. But Jesus, being God and all that, would be able to go through it. And I don't think that's always doing justice to God, to Jesus. Because Jesus did become man. As much as He has the divinity of the Lord with Him, He also has our humanity there with Him. And our humanity is perhaps more at display on the cross than anything else, because that is what Christ came to be, one with us, to experience life and human weakness just as we do. And the cross shows that, shows His pain and shows His suffering. And so we should always think at least 10 times before we just try to justify His sufferings, saying that, oh, He was just God. No, He was human as well. And we can't do that. We find it difficult to do that, because then we have to really accept the pain, the real pain of the cross, and we'd rather avoid it. So we put a filter. And the third filter with which we look at Jesus' cross, and this is more important for what we have to discuss today, is we look at Jesus' cross and His sufferings through His physical pain. So we see that, I remember even in Mel Gibson's movie, when the cross was going, when the nails were going through His hand, through the cross, and also that whole scene where they flip the cross and Jesus is almost the first time hanging by the nails. It was the hardest sight for me to behold. I still don't think I've been able to watch that scene completely. I cringe and I do close my eyes. I must admit, I lack that courage. but uh, but I suppose the physical wounds of Jesus enamor us a lot. As also when we see many of the saints have got what is known as the stigmata, the physical wounds of Jesus that they bear on their own flesh, on their own body. And so when we look at the cross, we very directly imagine the cross to be these wounds in his side, in his hands, on his feet, even on the crown, on his head. But what is important for us to understand is that Jesus's body did not suffer. I know that the Gospels often house the physical pain that Jesus gave. Even the Passion of Christ, the movie, explored the physical pain of Jesus much, much more. But above everything else, Jesus suffered mentally and spiritually as well. Jesus suffered emotionally as well. And what I wanted to do with you is in the next few minutes is to delineate the various different psychological, mental difficulties, even spiritual difficulties that Jesus suffered. And what we will do is we'll connect each of them to one of the wounds of Jesus and try to just explore Jesus within. That when we look at the cross, we simply don't just be satisfied reflecting on the physicality of Jesus' suffering, but also on his emotional and his mental side, the Jesus within who suffered. The first wound that we can reflect on is on the crown of Jesus. And this happened even before his crucifixion. And when the Roman soldiers put the crown and the reed in his hand and the sort of the cloak on his shoulders, what they were doing, they were trying to mock Jesus, they were trying to humiliate Jesus. And so for me, the crown symbolizes the humiliation that Jesus went to within. It was not simply enough for the Roman soldiers and even for the Jews to kill Jesus. That was not the point of a Roman crucifixion, because they had other ways of killing him as well. The whole point was they needed to make an example out of Jesus. They reserved the crucifixion only for the worst criminals, and the worst crime by and large was when you went anti-state, when you became an anti-national, or in today's words, when you became some sort of terrorist. And that is how they viewed Jesus, his ministry, his disciples, his kingdom. That it was a threat to their kingdom, to their political stability. And so the only way to eliminate him for sure was that if you catch the leader and you make an example out of the leader and you humiliatingly kill him on a cross, it was as a sign or a symbol that should discourage his disciples from ever disbanding, and also from other persons who had such motives, ulterior motives against the state, to stop them from rising up, at least for a certain period of time. And so it was important for them to make an example out of Jesus, which is why they humiliate him at every step of the way. They're so brutal towards him, and then they kill him, then they leave him languishing on the cross. But even as we look at humiliation, what we see, or what we're supposed to see, is the response of Jesus to such a humiliation. If it was you or me, and even in our lives today, each of us goes through humiliations, different kinds, of all sorts really. What is our response is we feel very threatened, we feel very small. Some of us react, get very angry. Some of us close in and become completely, like we get into our shells and we feel very low about ourselves, we get very much depressed. But Jesus' response is so unique. I remember one of the scenes that is personally one of my favorites. Jesus is on the cross, he's languishing there, he's gone through all the humiliations they've thrown at him. And then the Jewish chief priests and some of the scribes are looking at Jesus and telling him, hey, if you are the Son of God, come down from all this, and then we will believe in you. I think there is this is the word. This is like throwing salt on your wounds and then just hurting you further, or throwing kerosene into the fire, just letting it boil even further. I'm like, you can just let him be, just let him die in peace. Like, you've got what you wanted. But they're still, if you say in Hindi, chabi lagawing Jesus, trying to catch him even at his weakest moment. And I can imagine that if it was God himself there, I could imagine that if I was there in that place and I was God, I think the whole wrath of God would just come upon them and completely destroy them. But Jesus does just the exact opposite. He doesn't even keep silent as he usually would prefer to at various points during his trial and his passion. He kept silent, but here he doesn't. He tells them, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Like Jesus gives a reason to them. Like he takes this humiliation, but he does not let them affect him too deeply. He does not let them affect him in a sense of taking away the love and the passion with which he is dying for them. No. He chooses to love them, and to love them by giving reasons, like, they don't know what they're doing. And I think this is a good tip or a trick we can use when we go through humiliations in life, that sometimes people are too much hurting themselves, and which is why they inflict this hurt on us. They are going through emotional upheavals themselves, and so they feel threatened by us. And so when in humiliation, instead of reacting or instead of going into your shell, just be firm. Take the hit, just like Jesus did. And when you do that, believe me, you will have the courage even more to look at Jesus on the cross without any filters. The second wound that we can reflect on is the wound in the hands of Jesus. As you and I know, hands are extremely personal to us. The work of our hands builds things. Like if you use your hands to build something, eventually you will build it. And then when you look at it, you have this sense of success. You have this sense of achievement, that you achieved something. When we look at the hands of Jesus on the cross that is crucified, I'm reminded of the failure of Jesus' mission. And when I say failure, I mean the apparent failure of Jesus' mission. Jesus had come into this world for a very specific plan, and then he spent his years under the tutelage of Mary and Joseph, learning, growing, becoming a human in its completion. And then he goes out, gets baptized under John the Baptist, and that starts his public ministry. And basically in those 3 years of his public ministry, he did great things. From becoming almost a nobody, like we don't even know who Jesus is, he became someone great, a Messiah, and people from all over came looking for him. He met great success. He was a healer, he was a preacher, he was an exorciser, he used to exorcise demons, he would love people. He formed a close set of disciples. He traveled so much. His name and his fame spread much because he traveled so much. So we see all of this success, and then suddenly he goes through this betrayal, he goes to condemnation, and his death, and right now he's on his cross, and all his past just seems erased. All the work that he did just seems so futile, just seems so useless. Like one would not even bother if cross is just going to be the end and everyone that you help is just going to betray you later, or is going to just in some way have their hand in your crucifixion. What's the point of it all? So by human standards, if you calculate, if you are like, suppose you're a mathematician, you want to weigh the scales, Jesus' whole life, it seems to have no sense if you look at him on the cross. I can imagine when people in Israel at that time looked at Jesus on the cross, they would just not be able to believe what they're seeing. That this man who did such great things is right now suffering on a cross. And that would make them question, was he as great as they had made him out to be in the first place? And it would create a lot of doubts and a lot of fears, etc., etc. But what we need to realize is that ultimately, this very failure, this very apparent failure, is success for Jesus. Because no matter the healings and miracles and preachings he did, for Jesus, his path was always clear, that I am here to suffer and to die. The Messiah must suffer and die, and then on the third day, he will rise again. And so for Jesus, there is no cross only. There's always a cross attached to the resurrection. And because of that, he goes through this failure. He allows these people, us, to judge him as a failure, as someone who completely lost everything on the cross. When we go through failures in our life, it is very important for us to note that, as St. Paul says it, that even the foolishness of God is greater than human wisdom. That what we can look at failure, that in the eyes of God, it is something great. Because believe it or not, when we fail, when we reach rock bottom and there's nowhere below to go, that is where we are completely in a position to surrender to God. That is a place when we are failing, is a place or is a point in life where you will stop believing in your powers, you will stop believing in the powers of influential people able to help you, and you will really start believing in the power of God. And you will really be able to come to know what is this Jesus, or who is this Jesus, this God man who came to save us for our sins. What is really Christianity all about? It is about that when you think that you are failing, or when you have failed already, that is where God has the great power to raise you up, to lift you up. And this should fill us with hope. And so even though we look at Jesus' failure by objective standards, by worldly standards, as a failed mission, perhaps even like a failed God amongst all other gods of other religions, you'll never find any other religion propagating that their God could die. No, at least their God will not die to save someone else. In the sense, they'll find other means of saving through their power, through their strength, etc., etc. But our God has specifically chosen through death to give us life and salvation. And so nothing can faze us, not even death can faze us. But death, that itself, which is the enemy of man, should fill us with hope, should fill us with a sense of success, because Jesus has gone beyond that. The third wound that we reflect on is the wound in the feet of Jesus. And for me, this signifies, feet signify in a sense our ability to move, our ability to go out of our privateness, our aloneness, and enter into a place that is filled with people, and to relate with people, to get into interactions with them. And so the fact that Jesus' feet were pierced and the wounds appeared is a sign of his absolute loneliness on the cross. And it is very beautifully expressed in that one line, my God, why have you forsaken me? Jesus, through the beginning of his ministry, first of all gets 12 disciples. And not just 12, but many more other disciples who followed him, who believed in his cause. And then apart from that, you had many followers of Jesus, both on his side and some against him as well, who were just there with him, beholding him. And so Jesus was very popular. Everyone knew who Jesus was. And from there, slowly, as you come closer and closer to Jerusalem and then his crucifixion, you will find that one by one, everyone starts going away. Eventually, including his disciples. And at the cross, it's just Mary and a few others who are present. And eventually, Jesus is left all alone. And worse than that is perhaps that on the cross, he felt that even God has abandoned him. Jesus shared a very close relationship with God. His relationship had a name. He called God Abba. He called God Father. He never related to God as God. He would always say Father. But on the cross, you see, he uses the words, my God, why have you forsaken me? Does it mean that God abandoned Jesus on the cross? That's a very dicey thing to say. But what is important to understand is that at the cross, during that experience of pain, God did not have the joy of knowing that his Father was with him. His Father was with him, but in obscurity, but in darkness, the darkness of faith. And many saints have called this the dark night of the soul, a difficult spiritual experience, an absolute spiritual dryness, that no matter how much good you do, no matter how much prayer you do, you always feel God is far away from you. And so often in our lives, my dear friends, God calls you and I too to such a spiritual dryness, to such a spiritual darkness, where God is present, but he's obscure, but he's present in darkness that we can't really face him. And the reason why God gives us this sort of an experience in life is to help us grow. God wants us to be dependent on nothing, not even on him. But God wants us to relate with him out of love and faith, not out of dependency, but out of love, genuine, passionate love for God. And when we go through dark nights, dark periods of life, periods of dryness, we are forced to choose to love God even when there is no apparent reason to love him, when he doesn't even seem to exist. Which is why it is the perfect test of our faith. When we go through difficult times, we go through darkness, especially a spiritual kind, when you're trying to pray, but you think and you feel like God is nowhere, And each one goes through it, Some people go through it for a longer period, some people go through it for a day, the next day they're back into prayer, they feel wonderful. Each one has a different, God gives a different test in that sense. But whatever it is, our call is to punch through, just like Jesus did, believing that God is present in obscurity and that He will turn the darkness and our dryness into light and into place, like a desert into a place flowing with vegetation, flowing with waters, fruitfulness. But for that, we have to go through our spiritual dryness and darkness with a lot of faith. The final wound that we have to discuss is the wound in the side of Jesus. And this wound, in a sense, symbolizes betrayal. The reason is because, first of all, God created Eve out of the side of Adam, and their relationship is one of intimacy and one of love. And the exact opposite of that is betrayal. And we see that Jesus was betrayed by Judas as well as by Peter. Very often people will give more weightage towards Judas's betrayal, but Peter's betrayal too was nothing less. Both of them, disciples, and not just the two of them, but even all the other disciples, when they fled from the scene, when they did not come to the aid of Jesus, when they did not come to the condemnation trial of Jesus, all of that is constituted as a sort of a betrayal. And so these very people who were the closest to Jesus for 3 years, where Jesus poured out everything, all of His secrets, all of His ministry work to them, when He needed them the most, they fled from the scene. But the amazing thing about Jesus is, once the resurrection happens and post-resurrection, as He starts appearing to each of them, the first thing He will say is, "Peace be with you." And very interestingly, nowhere you will find Jesus even alluding to this betrayal. It's the strangest thing. Betrayal, by definition, is something very worse to a person. Suppose the one betrays me. Basically, betrayal is what? That the one that you had full trust on, the one that was closest to you, the one that you never even thought that this person would ever go against you, he or she himself betrays you, goes against you, does damage to you. And because we don't expect it, it hits us hard, and sometimes people take a lifetime to get over a particular betrayal. And no amount of sorries can ever make up for it. But we see that this very human thing, betrayal, which is perhaps the worst thing a human can go through, was what? Jesus doesn't even allude to it after the resurrection. Why? What I feel, one of the major reasons was because somewhere Jesus expected it. And we know that for Peter as well as for Judas, in some way or the other, Jesus did indicate that you will betray me. So be careful. Don't let the enemy overpower you. Watch and pray, etc., etc. So the wisdom of Jesus was such that He knew the hearts of men. He did not place more expectations on men than they could handle. And so often John's Gospel will say, but Jesus knew what was in their hearts, so He did not give Himself to them completely. He was on guard. Because Jesus knew and understood that at some point human nature does take over, and until I save them and until I prove to them and show them the love that God has, they will not be able to assimilate it, and they will not be able to be martyrs for me. That will come only after the resurrection. And so even in our life, whenever we go through betrayals, and I'm sure each of us in some form or the other has gone through many betrayals, what is important for us to realize is that ultimately what God teaches us through these betrayals is that our trust should be 100% only in Him. To everyone else, it should be always provisional. We should trust them, have good relationships, maintain good relationships, but always realize at some point, human beings can give up on you. They can even betray you. But God will never abandon you. God will never betray you. As I mentioned, even in obscurity, even in darkness, God is present. Even darkness is not too dark for God to be present. And that should be the hope that we should really be living with, which will help us to overcome betrayal or experiences of betrayal or future experiences of betrayal that may come into our life. As you enter Holy Week, as you enter the time where we will reflect on the Passion of Christ more deeply as compared to the entire year, consider these 4 points that I have placed before you, these 4 psychological sufferings that Jesus went through. As you look at his wounds, and we often say, associate your wounds to the wounds of Jesus. And one of the best ways to do that is to look at these 4 mental aspects, emotional aspects of Jesus' suffering that we've gone through, right from the first of humiliation to the failure of mission, to failures in life, through his loneliness, and finally through the betrayals that we go through, and attach it to the cross, this Holy Week, and experience the resurrection as we all wait for Easter that's very near.